just to introduce myself, my name is Dana Ritchie. I'm the managing editor of the PACE International Law Review. If you wouldn't mind just giving some background information on your knowledge and background in this area.
Sure. Well, I started out as a human rights advocate, working for women's rights NGOs, non-governmental organizations. My first job out of law school was at the Center for Reproductive Rights as a fellow in their international department. And I continued to work for women's rights NGOs until I worked for an organization called Just Detention International, which is a human rights NGO that works on sexual violence issues against men and women in juvenile detention, jails, prisons, immigration detention. And after doing that advocacy work, I moved to UCLA, where I direct our graduate programs, LLM and SJD programs, and I also teach and write in the area of human rights.
Great. All right, well, let's get to our first question.
Okay.
In your opinion, how are international consensus regarding sex and gender evolving over time?
Well, evolving, I would say, quite rapidly. For many, many years, the role of women and abuses that befall women were neglected by the UN and by international human rights instruments. And partly that's because of this so-called state actor hurdle. So unless it was the state perpetrating the harm, it was seen as being outside the province of human rights law. So international women's NGOs organized and advocated to change this. So while for many men they were being harmed in the public sphere by state actors, but for many women the harms that they were experiencing were happening in the private sphere. So domestic violence, for example, perpetrated by an intimate partner was seen as outside of the rubric of international human rights law because it wasn't being perpetrated directly by the state. But that has since changed, and now states are seen as having a duty to protect women and men against harms that are perpetrated by private actors. So that's probably been the biggest change. An emphasis with some emerging frameworks, health and human rights, sexuality as a human rights issue. Those are issues that I think are more on the cutting edge of where human rights scholarship and advocacy is happening today.
And there's now many international conventions and protocols centering on human rights for women. Would you say that since there hasn't been as many for men, is that because, as you attribute to, that it's more so in the public sector and unnecessary, or what would you attribute that to?
Well, I wouldn't say that there aren't human rights instruments that apply to men. There are lots of human rights instruments that are gender neutral and that apply to both women and men. And as I said earlier, a lot of the early human rights instruments, probably disproportionately, were relevant to men's lives. The ways in which men are actually left out of the human rights canon as it stands today is when matters of sexuality are discussed. So in particular, reproductive rights, sexuality, roles in family life, and most saliently, I think, in terms of sexual violence.
Do you think there need to be separate international instruments for protecting homosexuals as opposed to just the men and women that you were just talking about?
Well, separate instruments can be somewhat troubling because then you set up these very siloed, bifurcated realms for international legal interventions. And so I don't necessarily advocate that. I do advocate for much more robust realization of sexuality within the international human rights canon. And there are certainly lots of NGOs that are advocating for that and pushing up against some of the limitations that we see in the current instruments. So part of it is an interpretation issue. Can we or should we include discrimination based on sex as relevant to discrimination based on sexual orientation? That's an open question with different viewpoints on different sides. But I think certainly we do need to move in the direction of greater inclusion for all types of people and all different manifestations of gender as we continue to build this canon of law.
Okay. And do you think that these human rights instruments are having an impact on sexual violence in general?
Oh, it's such a tough question. Certainly these are big debates that are happening in academia. When you look at Anne Hathaway, Derek Jenks, Ryan Goodman, even Beth Simmons, some of the best legal thinkers are really rolling up their sleeves, trying to really understand the effectiveness of human rights law. So it's a bit tricky to answer. As someone who has been an advocate and worked on the ground, my own view is that these instruments are very central for advocates who, in some cases, have very underdeveloped national level laws that they're working with, and they certainly grab on to these international instruments and use them as tools in their own advocacy. It's just very hard to show a direct link between an instrument and changes on the ground. It's a big challenge, but it's something that I think some of our best minds are now working on.
Sounds like this is moving in a positive direction.
I hope so.
Well, that's all we have for today, so thank you for meeting with me.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.